ladies and gentlemen, today's top story, we're going to take a look at role of government, exactly what the government does to support business. So make sure you get your notes, you follow the Storm philosophy, sit back and enjoy. All right, so today we're going to take a look at the government, really break them down into different levels of government so we understand exactly their roles at each of these different levels. Then we're going to look at the major roles that government have in terms of business operations. All right, so with every country, or I should say most countries, there are three levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal. Each of these levels have different roles and responsibilities. For example, federal in Canada is in charge of criminal law, whereas provincial, property and civil rights, and municipal is water, sewage, and so on and so forth. All three levels of government really work together to really provide the economic functions, right? Public facilities and services, public well-being, regulating economic activity, and ensuring economic stability. How they do this is through the various roles that government provide. So the first role is the idea of permission. Most businesses and most countries, businesses need to register with the government to operate. Corporations need a charter. Other forms of businesses, like limited liability companies or partnerships, need other forms of registration. The function of this registration usually is to define the financial liability of the owners. It's to limit their risk. It's also to allow the government to monitor companies so that they can ensure that the businesses are thriving and succeeding. In Canada, a business owner needs to follow government regulations, and this includes completing the paperwork necessary to register the business. After registering with the Canadian Revenue Agency, the business will receive a registration number, HST number for taxation, corporate income tax account, import-export account, payroll deduction information, and a variety of other support services. In other countries, for example, in China, you need to go through 13 levels of government to comply with the request. So it's a little bit more difficult in other countries than it is in Canada, and some people say that Canada has quite the paperwork to fill out. So with legal, this is where we're talking about laws and regulatory enforcement. So businesses provide contracts with other businesses, and these could be very difficult to understand, very complex. When two businesses merge, for example, there's a number of different things that needs to be ironed out. It's not so simple, like warranties on various things need to be ironed out. So the government needs to enforce these contracts, and they need to make sure that they are legally binding. So the courts need to step in at times to do this. Sometimes oral agreements are also difficult to to understand, but the government needs to also support these at times, even though written agreements definitely is the easiest one to enforce. But this is where the government needs to really support businesses and iron out any difficulties through the contracts, through disputing these contracts. They also provide a number of regulatory frameworks in place for businesses to operate in, and these need to be enforced and ensured that the businesses are operating within the parameters that they set out. So next is consumer protection. Now, unfortunately, not all businesses act in accordance of the law, for example, or even just are upstanding. And so sometimes the government needs to step in and ensure that the consumer is protected, that they are safe, that the products that they're purchasing is safe and not going to harm them in any way. They also need to ensure that the consumer has guarantees and that the seller, the business, if they fail to honor that guarantee, then the consumer has recourse through governmental avenues. And again, the other idea is when the consumer is purchasing a product, that they are provided with the full information necessary to make the purchase a way that makes sense to them, right? So when they're purchasing food, for example, they want to make sure they have all the nutritional content on the packaging. And in Canada, we have quite the amount of information on this packaging because the government has stepped in and said this is how much information we need. So just like the government needs to protect consumers, they also need to ensure and protect employees. And employees need to be provided with the legal framework and government protection for their occupational health and safety. And so government has a branch of government oversees this and ensures that all employee locations, so all workplaces, have certain standards in place so that employees are protected, they feel safe, they feel secure. The other one here is the idea of hiring, right? So that employers can't hire based on anything they think is valid, that they actually have to follow certain procedures and that there's equal opportunity for all. And so employees, not just the ones working in the business, but potential employees are protected. Next is environmental protection. Now, this is where the government needs to step in and provide the, again, regulatory framework that pollution does not become such a huge issue. It is already an issue, but not such a huge issue, and tries to overcome this. Again, unfortunately, through interactions between consumers and producers, oftentimes what we call externalities take place, and so pollution happens as a byproduct, or other environmental waste happens as a byproduct, and governments need to ensure that this is not such a huge problem. The other part with this one is the resource protection. Resources are scarce and they're limited, and so the government needs to protect these so that we ensure long-term sustainable growth of our resources. So next out is the big one. This is taxation. Now, governments set budgets every year, and part of the budgets set aside certain funds for various things. Some are business initiatives in that, but they also need to set budgets in place in the tax rates in order to fulfill those budgets. And to do this is their attempt at achieving some income equality. Some corporations are taxed at the corporate level, and then the person is taxed at the personal level. And again, this is all to ensure that we live in a society where everyone benefits and that there's income equality for the most part. And last up is investor protection. Now, individuals and corporations both invest, and therefore the government needs to set the framework around that to ensure that there's no such thing as fraud, although we do know that happens. The government really tries to prevent that. They also really try and regulate the stock market so that, again, the idea of fair and competitive investments can be made. Ponzi schemes have become quite the thing lately, and governments really need to protect that. And the other part is the idea of white-collar crime really taking place, and again, governments really try and protect that as well. So just like we've talked about with government's involvement and influence on business and role, unfortunately we see more and more today of the corporate influence on governments, and there's several ways for corporations to influence governments. They contribute a large amount to political campaigns and really support politicians who will create legislation that is favorable to their business. They can influence governments by participating in trade missions, and so they accompany the government officials to other countries to ensure that their needs are met. Again, businesses really only concern themselves with profit rather than society, for example, and therefore companies believe that the implementation of emission controls, for example, may have a detrimental effect on them, and they'll raise that with the government. One major way that companies influence governments is through lobbying, and lobbying is the process through which companies, special interest groups, or individuals attempt to influence government officials and persuade them to endorse public policy favorable to them. Lobbyists are experts in their areas and in the policy process, and therefore they make some very useful to politicians who may not necessarily have the time, knowledge, or money to become experts on particular subjects, and therefore lobbyists really work on specific projects rather than broad issues or the whole government spectrum. And because of this, they may include taking part in government projects, obtaining grant money, etc., and therefore they have major influences on government. Lobbying Act of Canada regulates this activity to ensure that there's no single group that can obtain funding to influence government policy, but we do know that it also does exist, and more so in the United States and Canada, but it's definitely happening more so here. All right, so that brings us to the end of the lecture. So consider this question: how do you benefit from government's involvement in business? Do you receive benefits as a result? So consider that. Get your notes in order, and that's it. That's all. That's everything. We'll see you tomorrow.